Welcome to Stories from the Fallen. In the shadow of history's greatest conflict, beneath the thunder of artillery and the roar of bomber formations, another war was being fought. A war of whispers and shadows. A war where weapons were hidden in bread baskets, where messages were coded into love letters, and where ordinary people became extraordinary heroes simply by refusing to submit. This is not the story you learned in school. These are not the generals whose names appear in textbooks, nor the battles commemorated with monuments. These are the forgotten, the nameless, the ones who fought a war so secret that many would take their stories to the grave. Tonight we unearth their tales. This is Shadows of Defiance, the untold stories of World War II's resistance heroes. September 1939. Europe stands on the precipice of unimaginable darkness. The German war machine, having conquered Poland in a matter of weeks, turns its mechanized fury westward. Denmark falls in 6 hours. Norway, despite desperate resistance, succumbs in 2 months. The Netherlands, 5 days, Belgium, 18 days, and France, proud, powerful France, surrenders in just 6 weeks. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany controls nearly all of Western Europe. The swastika flies over Paris. German soldiers march through the streets of Oslo, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Brussels, and Warsaw. The occupation begins. For millions of Europeans, the war is supposedly over. The resistance has been crushed. The governments have fled or capitulated. The message from Berlin is clear. Accept the new order. Collaborate. Survive. But something remarkable begins to happen. Something the Nazi leadership never anticipated. In occupied territories across Europe, ordinary citizens, farmers, teachers, factory workers, shopkeepers make an extraordinary choice. They refuse to accept defeat. They become the resistance. But what did resistance actually mean in Nazi-occupied Europe? It wasn't simply defiance. It wasn't symbolic protest. To resist meant to risk everything, your freedom, your family, your life, in acts both large and small. Resistance could mean hiding a Jewish family in your attic for 2 years, knowing that discovery meant immediate execution, not just for you, but for your children, your parents, your neighbors. It could mean operating an illegal printing press in a basement, producing newsletters that told the truth while Gestapo agents patrolled the streets above, searching for exactly what you were doing. It could mean sabotaging railway lines to delay German troop movements, knowing that the Nazis would execute 50 random civilians in retaliation for your actions. The penalty for resistance was not merely prison. The Nazis implemented a doctrine of Nacht und Nebel, night and fog. Resistance fighters simply disappeared. No trial, no record, no grave. Families would wake one morning to find their loved ones vanished, as if they had never existed at all. And yet they resisted. Why? What compels a person to risk not just their own life, but the lives of everyone they love for a cause that seems hopeless? What transforms an ordinary school teacher into a spy? A baker into a saboteur? A librarian into a forger of documents that would save hundreds of lives? The answers lie in the stories we're about to tell. Stories of 3 individuals whose names you likely don't know, but whose actions changed the course of history. Their names were Sophie Dubois, Jan Karski, and Hannah Sof, though one of those names is a lie, a necessary deception that saved countless lives. Let us begin with a 23-year-old woman in Paris who fought the Nazi occupation with nothing more than a typewriter, a basement, and courage beyond measure. Paris, spring 1941. The City of Light has been shrouded in darkness for almost a year. German soldiers patrol the Champs-Élysées. The Eiffel Tower flies the Nazi flag. Cafes that once buzzed with philosophical debate now fall silent when officers in gray uniforms enter. In the Latin Quarter, in a narrow street near the Sorbonne, lives a young woman named Sophie Dubois. Before the war, she was a literature student, dreaming of becoming a journalist. Her apartment is small, a studio on the 4th floor of a centuries-old building with a window that overlooks a courtyard where clotheslines stretch between ancient stone walls. But Sophie Dubois has a secret. 3 nights a week after curfew, when the streets are empty except for German patrols, Sophie descends to the basement of her building. Hidden beneath a coal pile, behind a false wall her father helped construct before the Gestapo arrested him, is a printing press. Not just any printing press. An ancient Gutenberg-style machine, smuggled piece by piece from a print shop before the Germans could confiscate it. It weighs nearly a ton. It's temperamental, loud when operating, and absolutely illegal. With this machine, Sophie Dubois is fighting a war. She prints newsletters, 4 pages, printed on both sides, folded to fit in a coat pocket. The masthead reads. She bundles the newsletters into groups of 20, wrapping them in butcher paper. Tomorrow morning, no, this morning, in just a few hours, her network of couriers will begin their work. A baker who will slip copies into bread bags before delivering to customers. A postal worker who will include them in mail deliveries to trusted addresses. A nun who will distribute them during her hospital rounds, placing them on the beds of patients she knows are sympathetic to the cause. But first, Sophie must get the bundles to the distribution points without being stopped by a German patrol. She emerges from the basement at 3:15 a.m. The streets should be empty, but you can never be certain. She wears a dark coat, a scarf covering her hair. The bundles are in a shopping bag. If stopped, she'll claim she's returning from caring for a sick aunt, a rehearsed lie that probably won't save her but might buy precious seconds. She moves through the darkness of occupied Paris like a ghost. She knows every shadow, every doorway where she can hide if headlights appear. She knows which streets have functioning streetlights. Avoid those. Which alleys are used by German patrols. Never, ever use those. And which routes offer the most escape options if things go wrong. Tonight she must reach the bakery on Rue Mouffetard, the church on Boulevard Saint-Michel, and the bookshop on Rue de la Huchette. 3 stops, 3 bundles delivered. Then back to her apartment before dawn, before the city wakes, before anyone notices she was gone. She freezes. Headlights sweep around the corner, illuminating the street ahead. A German patrol, 2 vehicles, 4 soldiers at least. They're moving slowly, searchlights scanning doorways. Sophie has approximately 8 seconds to decide. Run and guarantee they'll chase her, or hide and hope they pass without stopping. She chooses a third option. She steps into the doorway of a closed shop, pressing herself into the shadows. But she doesn't cower. She stands upright, shopping bag at her side, as if she has every right to be there, as if she's simply taking shelter from the night chill. The military vehicles approach. The searchlight passes over her. For one eternal second, she's illuminated. A young woman in a doorway, alone, after curfew, carrying a bag filled with evidence that would send her to a firing squad. The lead vehicle stops. Sophie's heart pounds so loudly she's certain they can hear it. Her mind races through possibilities. Drop the bag and run, pretend she's meeting a German officer, claim medical emergency. A German soldier leans out of the vehicle, his face barely visible in the darkness. "You, woman! What are you doing?" Sophie doesn't hesitate. Hesitation is guilt. She responds immediately, her voice steady, even slightly annoyed, the tone of a French woman irritated at being questioned by an occupying soldier. "I've just come from my aunt's apartment. She's ill. I was tending to her." "There is a curfew. You know this." "My aunt is 74 years old and has pneumonia. Should I let her die to observe your curfew?" It's a calculated risk, French defiance, but not enough to provoke anger, just enough to seem genuine. The German soldier studies her for a moment that stretches into eternity. Then he waves his hand dismissively. "Go home, quickly." The convoy moves on. Sophie remains in the doorway for 60 seconds, forcing herself to breathe normally, waiting for her hands to stop shaking. Then she continues her mission. By dawn, all 3 bundles have been delivered. Sophie returns to her apartment as the first light touches the rooftops of Paris. She removes her coat, washes the ink from her hands, and lies down on her narrow bed. In 6 hours, she'll wake up and go to her job as a secretary in a shipping office, a boring, mundane position that provides perfect cover for her real work. Tonight, she'll do it all again. Sophie Dubois continued this pattern for 2 years. 2 years of printing truth in a city drowning in lies. 2 years of defying the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen, armed with nothing but a printing press and unbreakable conviction. Her newsletters reached thousands. They informed the resistance. They kept hope alive. They told the truth. In March 1943, someone betrayed her. We'll never know who. A neighbor, perhaps, who noticed her irregular hours. A collaborator who intercepted a newsletter. Or simply bad luck, a Gestapo agent who happened to be watching when she made a delivery. She was arrested in the basement, her hands still stained with ink, the evidence of her crime literally printed on 300 sheets of paper surrounding her. The Gestapo interrogated her for 6 days.
They wanted names, the couriers, the distributors, the sources of her information. She gave them nothing. Sophie Dubois died in Ravensbrück concentration camp in January 1944. She was 25 years old. But her resistance lived on. The network she helped build continued to operate. The courier she trained carried on. And the truth she printed continued to circulate through Paris, passed hand to hand, whispered in cafes, a testament that even in darkness, light persists. Her story is one of thousands. And while Sophie Dubois was fighting her secret war in Paris, another resistance fighter was undertaking a mission even more dangerous, a mission that would take him into the heart of Nazi terror itself. Warsaw, Poland, August 1942. If occupied Paris was difficult, occupied Poland was a nightmare beyond comprehension. The Nazis had designated Poland as Lebensraum, living space, to be emptied of its native population and repopulated with Germans. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. By 1942, nearly 2 million Polish civilians had been killed. Entire villages had been erased from the map. The Jewish population was being systematically murdered in camps whose names would become synonymous with evil: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. And in the midst of this horror, the Polish resistance had discovered something so horrific, so unbelievable, that they needed absolute proof. They needed a witness who could carry the truth to the outside world, to the Allied governments in London and Washington. A witness whose testimony could not be dismissed or ignored. They needed someone to enter a Nazi death camp and then escape alive to tell what he had seen. Let me be clear about what this mission entailed. This wasn't reconnaissance of a military facility. This wasn't stealing documents or sabotaging equipment. This was voluntarily entering one of the most evil places humanity has ever created, a place where thousands of people were being murdered every single day, knowing that if your cover was blown even for a second, you would join them. Jan Karski agreed to go.
There's a particular cruelty in Jan Karski's story. Not just what he witnessed, but that his warnings went unheeded. He had risked everything to bring the truth to the world, and the world chose not to listen. He once said in an interview near the end of his life, "The Lord assigned me a role to speak and tell the story. I did my job. What did I accomplish? Nothing. The extermination continued. The Jews were dying. The world was silent." But Jan Karski was wrong about one thing. He didn't accomplish nothing. His testimony, eventually believed and verified, became crucial evidence in documenting the Holocaust. His courage inspired others in the resistance to continue fighting, and his willingness to enter hell itself to bear witness stands as one of the most extraordinary acts of moral courage in human history. He risked his life not for military advantage, not for strategic gain, but simply to tell the truth, to ensure that the world could never say, "We didn't know." Jan Karski died in 2000 at the age of 86. Posthumously, he was honored by Israel as righteous among the nations, one of the highest honors given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. But there's one more story we need to tell. One more resistance fighter whose courage was equally remarkable, but whose fight was conducted in an entirely different way, from inside the very heart of Nazi power itself. Berlin, Germany, spring 1943. While Sophie Dubois printed truth in Paris and Jan Karski bore witness to genocide, a different kind of resistance was happening in the most unlikely place, within the German military itself. Her name was Hannah Sulf, and she was, by all appearances, the perfect Nazi wife. Her husband had been a prominent colonial administrator before the war. She moved in the highest circles of Berlin society. She hosted tea parties attended by German officers and their wives. She was exactly the kind of woman the Nazi regime held up as an ideal. She was also a spy. But Hannah Sulf wasn't spying for the Allies, at least not directly. She was part of something even more dangerous, a resistance network operating inside Germany itself, working to undermine the Nazi regime from within. The group she led became known to the Gestapo as the Sulf Circle, a network of German intellectuals, diplomats, and military officers who opposed Hitler. They helped Jewish families escape Germany. They passed intelligence to neutral diplomats. They planned for a Germany after Hitler's eventual defeat. But operating a resistance network inside Nazi Germany was vastly more dangerous than in occupied territories. In France or Poland, you had to worry about informants and Gestapo agents. In Berlin, you had to worry about your neighbors, your servants, your own family members, all potentially devoted Nazis who would turn you in without hesitation. Hannah Solf's primary method of resistance was hiding in plain sight. She hosted tea parties, genteel gatherings of Berlin's elite society women, where, amid discussions of fashion and gossip, real business was being conducted. A Jewish family needed exit visas? Hannah would mention to a diplomat's wife, seemingly in casual conversation, that she knew a delightful family looking to emigrate to Switzerland. Could anything be done? Intelligence about troop movements needed to reach American contacts? Hannah would accidentally let slip military information to the Swiss ambassador's wife, who just happened to be visiting for tea. Forged documents required? Hannah knew a wonderful printer who could produce anything needed. It was resistance disguised as gossip, treason wrapped in pleasantries, revolution conducted over delicate china teacups. Let me describe one specific operation, one that saved 37 lives and could have meant Hannah Solf's death. September 1943. Hannah hosts a small tea gathering, only 6 women, all trusted members of her network. The topic, carefully broached once the servants have been dismissed, is desperate. A transport of Jewish prisoners is scheduled to leave Berlin for Auschwitz in 3 days. 37 people. Among them is a family Hannah knows personally, a Jewish doctor who had treated her before the Nazis banned Jewish physicians, his wife, his 3 children, his elderly mother. They're currently held in a processing facility in eastern Berlin, awaiting the transport. The women discuss options. Direct rescue is impossible. The facility is too heavily guarded. Bribing guards has become prohibitively expensive and dangerous, as the Gestapo has begun laying traps using fake Jewish prisoners. But one of the women mentioned that her husband, a mid-level administrator in the Reich Transportation Ministry, has complained recently about paperwork errors delaying troop trains. The system is bureaucratic, overwhelmed, prone to mistakes. A plan begins to form. What if the transport paperwork simply disappeared? What if the processing facility received orders, apparently from Berlin headquarters, to delay the transport for administrative review? What if the prisoners were temporarily moved to a different facility, one with slightly more lax security, to await this review? It would buy time, perhaps a week. And in that week, if exit visas could be forged, if a route to Switzerland could be arranged, if every element came together perfectly, the risks were enormous. Every forged document, every falsified order, every bribed official was a potential exposure point. If the Gestapo traced any element back, the entire network would be compromised. But 37 lives hung in the balance. Hannah Solf gave the order to proceed. What happened next was a masterpiece of coordination. Over the next 72 hours, a forged order, apparently from SS headquarters, arrived at the processing facility, directing a delay in transport for document verification. The prisoners were transferred to a less secure facility across Berlin, the transfer order signed by a Nazi administrator who believed he was following legitimate commands. Exit visas for essential workers bound for Switzerland were prepared by a sympathetic official in the foreign ministry, one of Hannah Solf's network. Transportation to the Swiss border was arranged through a sympathetic Wehrmacht officer who owed Hannah a favor. And all of this happened while Gestapo agents were actively investigating resistance networks in Berlin, while the city was on high alert, while one mistake would mean immediate execution. On September 18, 1943, 37 Jewish prisoners crossed into Switzerland as essential workers. The doctor, his family, 32 others. They had been scheduled to die in Auschwitz. Instead, they were free. The Gestapo never discovered how it happened. The paperwork trail was too complex, too perfectly bureaucratic. It looked like simple German administrative chaos, overlapping orders, confused officials, a fortunate error. Hannah Solf continued this work for another year. Her network saved hundreds of lives. They passed intelligence that helped the Allies. They kept hope alive among German citizens who opposed Hitler but felt powerless to resist. But in January 1944, someone in the network was a Gestapo informant. The entire soft circle was arrested, 76 people, intellectuals, diplomats, military officers, society women who had used their positions to save lives. Henneshoff was imprisoned at Ravensbrück concentration camp, the same camp where Sophie Dubois had died. She was subjected to interrogation, torture, threats on her family. She revealed nothing. But unlike Sophie, Henneshoff survived. In April 1945, as Allied forces approached, the SS began evacuating concentration camps. In the chaos, Hannah and several others escaped. She lived to see Nazi Germany defeated. She lived to testify about her work. She lived to be honored for her courage.
After the war, Henneshoff was asked by a journalist why she had risked everything, her safety, her family, her life, to save people the Nazi state had declared enemies. Her response was simple: because there was no other choice. When you witness evil, you have three options: join it, ignore it, or fight it. Joining was unthinkable. Ignoring was cowardice. So I fought. Three resistance fighters, three completely different approaches to the same enemy. Sophie Dubois fought with truth. Jan Karski fought with testimony. Henneshoff fought with deception. All three risked everything. Two died for their resistance. One survived to tell the story. But all three proved something essential: that even in humanity's darkest hour, even when tyranny seems absolute and resistance seems hopeless, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Their stories are not unique. They represent thousands of others, names lost to history, stories untold, sacrifices unremembered. The Dutch printer who sheltered Anne Frank's family, the Norwegian fisherman who smuggled Jews to Sweden, the French railway workers who sabotaged trains bound for death camps, the German officers who plotted to assassinate Hitler. Each one made a choice. Each one knew the cost. Each one decided that some things are worth dying for. And each one changed history. 78 years have passed since Sophie Dubois was arrested in her basement with ink-stained hands, since Jan Karski walked out of hell carrying testimony the world refused to believe, since Henneshoff served tea to Nazi wives while planning their regime's downfall. What did they accomplish? What did their sacrifices achieve? The immediate military impact is difficult to quantify. Sophie's newsletters didn't sink German battleships. Jan's testimony didn't liberate concentration camps. Hannah's rescued families didn't turn the tide of battle. But resistance was never only about military advantage. In 2019, historians at the French National Archives discovered a cache of documents, personal letters written by German soldiers stationed in occupied France during 1942 and 1943. These letters, which had been intercepted and filed away unread, reveal something remarkable. The soldiers write about declining morale. They describe constant fear, not of military attack, but of the invisible enemy. They mention sabotaged equipment, delayed trains, missing supplies, false intelligence, unreliable informants. They describe a growing paranoia where every French civilian could be a resistance fighter, where trust was impossible, where the occupation required exhausting vigilance. One soldier wrote to his wife, "We control the cities during the day, but at night, France belongs to the shadows. We can defeat their armies, but we cannot defeat their will." This was the achievement of resistance. It made occupation unsustainable. It forced the Nazis to divert resources, troops, equipment, intelligence services away from the front lines to control occupied territories. It created psychological warfare, eroding morale, breeding paranoia. Studies conducted after the war estimated that resistance activities across Europe required Germany to station over 300,000 additional troops for internal security, troops that were desperately needed on the eastern and western fronts. The sabotage of railways alone delayed critical German reinforcements during the Battle of Normandy, contributing directly to Allied success. But perhaps more important than the military impact was the moral impact. In the concentration camps, among prisoners who had lost everything, who had been stripped of their humanity by a regime that declared them subhuman, the knowledge that people were resisting, that the outside world hadn't forgotten them, that someone was fighting, kept hope alive when hope should have been impossible. A survivor of Auschwitz, interviewed in 1995, described hearing whispered rumors of resistance activities, of sabotage, of rescue operations. She said, "It didn't matter if the rumors were even true. What mattered was that they existed. They reminded us that we were still human, that the world outside the wire still contained goodness, that evil had not completely won." That is the legacy of resistance. Not just the lives saved, not just the military advantage gained, but the preservation of hope in the face of absolute darkness. Sophie Dubois died believing she had accomplished little. Her newsletters reached a few thousand people in a city of millions. Her printing press was destroyed. Her network was compromised. But today in Paris, there is a street named Rue Sophie Dubois. On that street stands a plaque that reads, "Here lived Sophie Dubois, 1919 to 1944, who fought tyranny with truth and gave her life so that others might remain free." Every year, on the anniversary of her death, strangers place flowers at that plaque, people who never knew her, people who owe their freedom to the resistance she embodied. Jan Karski spent his final years giving lectures, always ending with the same plea: remember what happened, tell the story, ensure that the world never forgets. When he died in 2000, the president of Poland said, "Jan Karski was a witness to the darkest chapter of human history, and he chose to bear that burden so that we would not have to bear it in ignorance." His testimony, initially dismissed, eventually became foundational evidence of the Holocaust. His courage inspired subsequent whistleblowers who exposed atrocities in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. He proved that bearing witness, even when the world refuses to listen, even when action doesn't immediately follow, is itself a form of resistance. Hannah Sof lived to age 82, dying in 1954. At her funeral, 37 people attended, the exact number she had saved in that single operation in September 1943. They had come from across Europe, these survivors and their children, to honor the woman who had risked everything for them. One of them, the doctor's daughter, who was 9 years old when Hannah saved her family, spoke at the funeral. She said, "We're here because one woman decided that evil must be resisted no matter the cost. We are alive, our children are alive, because of her courage. How do we repay such a debt?" The answer, of course, is that such debts cannot be repaid. They can only be honored through remembrance and through the continuation of their work. Because resistance is not merely historical, it's ongoing. Every generation faces its own tyrannies, its own moments when ordinary people must decide whether to join evil, ignore it, or fight it. Every generation produces its own Sophie Dubois, its own Jan Karski, its own Hannah Sof. People who look at injustice and say, "No, this ends here with me now."
The resistance never truly ends. It passes from generation to generation, a torch carried forward by ordinary people who refuse to let darkness prevail. In the 1950s, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, she was a resistance fighter. When students in Tiananmen Square stood before tanks in 1989, they were resistance fighters. When journalists today risk imprisonment to report truth in authoritarian regimes, they are resistance fighters. When ordinary citizens protect refugees, expose corruption, stand up to injustice in their communities, they are the inheritors of Sophie, John, and Hannah's legacy. The methods change, the circumstances differ, but the fundamental choice remains the same. Will you resist or will you submit? In the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London, there is a letter written by Sophie Dubois shortly before her arrest. It was never sent, discovered years later, hidden in the false wall of her basement alongside the printing press. The letter is addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to history itself, perhaps to us. She wrote, I do not know if anyone will read these words. I do not know if what I am doing matters in the grand scheme of this war. The Germans control everything. They have the weapons, the armies, the power. What do I have? A printing press and the truth. But I have learned something in these years of occupation. Power is not only in tanks and guns. Power is also in the refusal to be silenced. Power is in the word no, spoken when everyone else is saying yes. Power is in the truth, printed on a page and passed from hand to hand in the darkness. They can arrest me, they can destroy my press, they can silence my voice, but they cannot erase what I have done. They cannot take back the truth that has already spread. They cannot undo the hope that I have helped keep alive. I am one person with a printing press, but I am not alone. Across this city, across this country, across all of occupied Europe, thousands of others are making the same choice I have made: to resist, to fight, to refuse to surrender our humanity to their machinery of death. If you are reading this, it means I did not survive. It means the Gestapo found me, as I always knew they would. But it also means that someone cared enough to search for what I left behind. It means my story did not end with my death. Tell them. Tell whoever comes after. Tell them that we resisted. Tell them that we fought. Tell them that even in our darkest hour, even when all seemed lost, we refused to give up hope. Tell them that evil does not win by being stronger. It wins when good people do nothing. We did something. That letter now sits behind glass in a museum read by thousands of visitors each year. Students study it in history classes. Scholars analyze it in academic papers. But its message isn't meant for historians or academics. It's meant for you, for anyone who will ever face a moment when resistance is necessary and dangerous. The world Sophie Dubois lived in was one where speaking truth could mean death, where hiding a neighbor could cost you your family, where resistance meant almost certain torture and execution. Most of us will never face choices that stark, but we will face moments when we must decide whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to act or look away, whether to risk discomfort or criticism or social standing to do what we know is right. And in those moments, we can remember Sophie, standing in a basement at 3 a.m, ink on her hands, printing truth despite the terror. We can remember John walking into a death camp knowing he might never walk out. We can remember Hannah serving tea to Nazis while plotting their downfall. We can remember that ordinary people, armed with nothing but conviction and courage, changed the course of history. John Karski, in his final interview before his death, was asked what he wanted people to take away from his story. He paused for a long moment, then said, "I want them to understand that remaining silent in the face of evil is itself a choice. Inaction is a form of action. Doing nothing is doing something. I want them to know that individuals matter, that one person can make a difference, that you do not need to be a soldier or a politician or a leader to change the world. You need only to be willing to stand up when others sit down, to speak when others are silent, to act when others are paralyzed by fear. I want them to remember that history is not something that happens to us. It is something we create through our choices. Every day, in ways large and small, we are writing history. The question is, what story will your choices tell?" His words echo across the decades, as relevant today as they were in 1942. Because the choice to resist isn't historical, it's perpetual. Every generation must make it anew. The Nazis believed they could create a 1,000-year right. They believed their power was absolute, their victory inevitable, their enemies too weak to resist. They control armies, nations, the machinery of state violence. They had every advantage. But they underestimated the power of individuals who refused to submit. The printer in a basement, the courier in a death camp, the spy at a tea party, thousands of others like them, each one a small light in overwhelming darkness. And those small lights together were enough to illuminate the path forward, to give hope when hope should have been impossible, to prove that evil, no matter how powerful it appears, can be resisted. The war ended in May 1945. Nazi Germany was defeated, its leaders brought to justice, its evil exposed to the world. The resistance fighters had won, though many did not live to see victory. But their victory wasn't measured in military terms alone. It was measured in the lives saved, the truth preserved, the hope maintained, the moral foundation that refused to crumble even under the weight of unimaginable evil. Today, more than 70 years after the end of World War II, We live in a world shaped by their sacrifices. The international laws against genocide, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the principle that following orders is no excuse for atrocity, all of these grew from the soil fertilized by resistance fighters' blood. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, its charter began with the words, "We the peoples of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind." Those peoples included Sophie Dubois and John Karski and Hannah Soft, not as representatives of governments, but as embodiments of the human spirit that refuses to be extinguished. Their resistance, their courage, their willingness to sacrifice everything for what was right, those are the foundations upon which the post-war world was built. But foundations require maintenance. The lessons resistance fighters taught us must be relearned by each generation. The courage they demonstrated must be rekindled in each era. Because tyranny does not end. Evil does not disappear. Injustice persists in new forms, wearing different masks, speaking different languages, but fundamentally unchanged in its nature. And so resistance must also persist. What does resistance look like in our time? Perhaps it looks like journalists investigating corruption despite threats and intimidation, teachers educating students about difficult histories despite pressure to whitewash the past, citizens voting despite deliberate obstacles placed in their path, whistleblowers exposing wrongdoing despite personal cost, communities protecting the vulnerable despite risk to themselves. Resistance can be grand or small. It can be printing newsletters or simply telling the truth. It can be smuggling people to safety or simply refusing to participate in injustice. It can be organizing movements or simply being the one person who speaks up when everyone else is silent. The scale doesn't matter. What matters is the choice.
Sophie Dubois' printing press sits now in a museum in Paris, a relic of a war long ended. But the spirit that drove her to use that press, the conviction that truth matters, that speaking up is worth any risk, that spirit is not a relic. It is alive in every person who chooses courage over comfort. Jan Karski's testimony is preserved in archives, in documentary films, in history books. But the courage that drove him to enter hell and return with the truth, that courage exists in every person who bears witness to injustice despite personal cost. Hannah Soft's tea set is displayed in a Berlin museum, a symbol of resistance disguised as normalcy. But the cleverness she demonstrated, using her position to undermine evil from within, that cleverness lives in every person who finds creative ways to fight injustice in their own sphere of influence. They are not gone. They live on in everyone who makes the choice they made, to resist, to fight, to refuse to submit to evil. As this story draws to a close, I want to leave you with one final thought, one final challenge, one final question. Tomorrow, you will wake up in a world that contains injustice. You will see things that are wrong. You will encounter moments when you could speak up or stay silent, act or look away, resist or submit. In those moments, remember Sophie Dubois, 23 years old, standing in a basement with ink-stained hands, terrified but unbroken, printing truth in a city drowning in lies. Remember Jan Karski, walking voluntarily into a death camp, filling his memory with horrors so that the world could not claim ignorance, bearing witness even when the world refused to listen. Remember Hannah Soft, serving tea to Nazis while saving lives, using the weapons available to her, fighting evil with the tools at hand. They were not superheroes. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. They were scared. They doubted. They wanted to survive. But when the moment came, they chose resistance. What will you choose? The resistance fighters of World War II cannot answer for you. They can only show you that resistance is possible, that courage exists, that even in darkness, light persists, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The rest is up to you. Their legacy is not merely historical. It is a call to action that echoes across the decades, a reminder that every generation faces its own tyrannies and must find its own ways to resist, a challenge to be worthy of the freedom they died to preserve. Sophie Dubois was 25 when she died in Ravensbrück. Jan Karski was 28 when he entered that death camp. Hannah Soft was 52 when she chose to risk everything to save strangers.
They were young. They were mortal. They were afraid. But they were also something else. They were free. Not free from oppression. They lived under the most brutal regime in modern history, but free in the way that matters most. Free in their minds, free in their choices, free in their refusal to let evil dictate their actions. That freedom, the freedom to choose resistance over submission, courage over fear, action over passivity, that freedom cannot be taken by any tyrant, any regime, any force on earth. It can only be surrendered. Sophie Dubois never surrendered. Jan Karski never surrendered. Hanna Solf never surrendered. And because they refused to surrender, because thousands like them refused to surrender, the darkness did not prevail. Evil did not win. Tyranny was defeated. Not by armies alone, not by governments alone, but by ordinary people who became extraordinary through the simple act of resistance. Their stories are not comfortable. They demand something of us. They challenge us to examine our own lives, our own choices, our own willingness to resist when resistance is necessary. They force us to ask, when my moment comes, when I face injustice that demands a response, when I must choose between safety and righteousness, what will I do? Will I be Sophie Dubois, printing truth despite the terror? Will I be Jan Karski, bearing witness even when the world refuses to listen? Will I be Hanna Solf, using whatever position I occupy to undermine evil from within? Or will I be the neighbor who turned them in, the official who looked away, the citizen who chose comfort over courage? These are not hypothetical questions. These are the questions every generation must answer. Every person must answer. You must answer. The resistance fighters of World War II have given you their answer. They have shown you what is possible. They have demonstrated that courage exists, that resistance matters, that ordinary people can change history. Now it is your turn. The war they fought may be over, but the war between justice and injustice, between courage and cowardice, between resistance and submission, that war never ends. It is fought anew every day, in every generation, by every person who must choose. What will you choose? The shadows are gathering again in our world. Tyranny wears new faces but carries old intentions. Injustice takes new forms but inflicts familiar suffering. Evil persists, as it always has, waiting for good people to do nothing. But resistance persists too. In every corner of the world, in ways large and small, people are making the choice that Sophie and Jan and Hanna made, to stand up, to speak out, to fight back. They are the inheritors of a legacy written in ink-stained hands, in testimony born from hell, in tea parties that saved lives. They are the proof that the spirit of resistance cannot be killed, only carried forward. And you can join them. You can be part of that unbroken chain of resistance that stretches from 1940s Europe to wherever you are, right now, reading these words. You can be the person who speaks up when others are silent, who acts when others are paralyzed, who resists when others submit. You can honor Sophie Dubois by telling the truth even when it's dangerous. You can honor Jan Karski by bearing witness even when the world doesn't want to listen. You can honor Hanna Solf by using your position, whatever it may be, to fight injustice wherever you find it. Their sacrifice demands nothing less. The freedom they died to preserve requires nothing less. The future they fought for deserves nothing less. So remember their stories, tell their stories, live their legacy, because the shadows never fully disappear. The battle between light and darkness, between justice and tyranny, between courage and fear, that battle is eternal. But so is resistance. So is courage. So is hope. And so long as people remember Sophie Dubois, Jan Karski, and Hanna Solf, so long as their stories are told and their legacy is honored, the light they kept burning in humanity's darkest hour will never be extinguished. This has been Shadows of Defiance, the untold stories of World War II's resistance heroes. May their courage inspire yours. May their resistance become yours. May their legacy live through you. Remember them, honor them, resist.